afternoon, or good evening. Oh my goodness, it's evening. And so I am getting on to give you an update on our second day of General Conference happenings. Today was split. We spent the morning in plenary and the afternoon doing our first work with Legislative Committee. I'm here in front of, and I'm in the exhibit hall in front of the communications sign. And I think that because of the way that phone cameras work, that you're actually seeing BUMC backwards. So I apologize for that, but they have a great setup here. This is the entrance to the exhibit hall. So you're kind of funneled this way and you go in and there's exhibits from seminaries and general agencies and vendors and of course, big Cokesbury display. So we started this morning with worship at 8 a.m. It was a brief worship, and then we went into plenary at 8:30. So today was, there was not voting in plenary, but there was, I want to share with you a little bit about what we did, but then also some of what we learned from the Daily Christian Advocate, which we get every day. And there were some interesting things that I want to highlight for you. So first, I'll talk about the Daily Christian Advocate. So each day when we arrive on our tables, we get that day's Daily Christian Advocate that has reports. All of this is also online for delegates. Non-delegates, you can also, I've mentioned before, you can get a subscription to the website with the Daily Christian Advocate material. But a couple of the interesting things from today's. The first is that we had our first full report from the Committee on Reference, which included, the first point is that the Standing Committee on Central Conference Concerns had requested it was approved to move petitions to the Standing Conference from other legislative committees. So the Standing Committee on Central Conferences has already been meeting this week. And we also saw in the Daily Christian Advocate that we saw the consent calendar. I'll talk about the consent calendar in a minute. So the Standing Committee on Central Conferences already had legislation that they created on regionalization. You may remember, if you've been following any of the discussions on regionalization, that there were several pieces of several plans, and all of the plans had several pieces of legislation because some are disciplinary and some are not disciplinary. There was a Christmas covenant. The Standing Committee had their own legislation. So, and there's other pieces floating out there. When I talk about this, the consent calendar, the Standing Committee had already approved and then sent to the plenary and sent to be calendared their legislation around regionalization. The Committee on Reference has approved moving almost all, maybe not all, maybe there are a few pieces I heard, maybe a few pieces that haven't yet been moved to the Standing Committee, essentially to move all regionalization material in terms of the preparatory work before plenary to the Standing Committee on Central Conferences. And so we saw that on the Committee of Reference. There was also some other information. The Alaska Annual Conference had asked and was approved to withdraw a request to become a district of Pacific Northwest. And so that was what the Committee on References was sharing about when different petitions got withdrawal, changed, moved around. The other thing, so the consent calendar. So we saw our first information on the consent calendar today. The way the consent calendar works, there's a couple different categories on the consent calendar. Consent calendar A are items that are approved from committee that contain disciplinary language. So certainly a number of the regionalization petitions contain disciplinary language. Consent calendar B are calendar items that are non-disciplinary, and A and B are both items that are approved by committee. And then consent calendar C contains a calendar item for which the committee recommendation is to refer. There was also a change in rules around petitions, a new rule around petitions that were voted against, and the way that they can be brought off the consent calendar to come, but that priority is given to items that are coming from legislative committees that are approved. So we had consent calendar items that were published today because they have to be published at least a day before they could come to the floor. And really nobody's been meeting except the Standing Committee on Central Conferences. And so that's what came. And so the Standing Committee on Central Conferences, they had a few pieces. They weren't all regionalization, but their regionalization pieces came. Now, consent calendar items are voted as a whole, up or down, and there's no discussion. If delegates want an item to be calendared for a full discussion on the floor, then they have to, so the consent calendar is published in the morning in the Daily Christian Advocate, and then delegates have to go to the General Conference office to request a form. They have to get 20 signatures of delegates, of seated credentialed delegates, to have an item taken off of the consent calendar so that it can be discussed and debated. Now, it'd be really fun if regionalization got approved off the consent calendar, but I suspect that it was pulled off the consent calendar today. It had to have been done by 3 p.m. And so we'll find out tomorrow when we'll get that report. The legislative committees will be beginning their work, but so far it was really just the standing committee that had already been meeting. So that was what we found out today, and I think, and so that's kind of interesting as we think about our work moving forward. Also, we had the Episcopal address. Bishop Jonathan Holston from South Carolina offered the Episcopal address, and one of the really interesting features of that Episcopal address is that I guess they'd worked with communications folks and put together basically a video montage from the past 8 years, like the things that happened since we met in 2016. Talked about what was happening in our United Methodist news, things that were happening in the world, things that were happening in our local churches. And one of his refrain was talking about who we are, who we say we are, who we want to be. And so the third piece kind of for each year was, the awesome ministry that was happening in our churches. And this is who God calls us to be. And so wonderful message. Those videos, you can hopefully find the links for those of you who asked. The live links are certainly online. I haven't been able to track yet where United Methodist News is putting the recordings, but the sign language live streams that have the sign language interpreters in the corner do seem to be staying on YouTube. So when you find those, if you find those links, you should at least be able to watch the videos that way if you're wanting to watch them before they're clearly up through United Methodist News. We had our monitoring report. We'll be receiving that every day. And then we had a break in the middle of the morning, but we had reports from some of the teams that have been working on major pieces that we know are part of the legislation before us. So the social principles revision, we had a report from them. We had a report from the General Book of Discipline team. They really were talking about the General Book of Discipline, but the tie to regionalization. And one of the things that we heard was, our Book of Discipline was written at a time when we were a U.S. church with mission outposts around the world. That's not us anymore. We are a global church. And so our structure and our Book of Discipline needs to reflect who we are. And so that global Book of Discipline, it was in the ADCA, and they're asking annual conferences to reflect on what's in there, trying to separate out in that global Book of Discipline, they're calling the General Book of Discipline. What are the things that really apply to everybody, and what are the things that can be contextualized? So that's not the same conversation as regionalization, but it's certainly along similar threads. So they'll be asking every annual conference to be giving feedback by the end of this year, December 31st, 2024. We also heard the young people's address. We heard from 2 young people, one from the Florida Conference and another speaking from, I think, Sierra Leone. And they had a powerful word to share. Again, I don't want to speak for them, so I would encourage you to check out the videos. They were scheduled to speak in 2020. And so as one of the speakers shared, that she wasn't as young, but still a younger member, a young adult in our church. We heard a presentation from Moses Kumar, who is the head of the General Counsel on Finance and Administration. If you've been following the financial news, we don't have as much money as we used to have. They're trying to decrease mission shares or apportionments so that annual conferences and local churches can keep more money there, but also at the same time that we are having declining numbers. And so there are significant cuts that are going to be proposed. And CFA also is highlighting some concerns with the Episcopacy Fund. They don't control how many bishops are elected, but I think really inviting delegates to reflect on that as they make decisions as well. And then finally in the morning, the Pathway to Our Next Expression presentation about really what comes next, including some bishops and our connectional table leaders who were part of that. We broke for lunch. And then in the afternoon, we spent from 2 to 4:30. Some committees finished quite quickly, organizing legislative committees. And so for the legislative committees, they had to elect a chair, a vice chair, and a secretary. And legislative committees may or may not have elected subcommittees based on how many petitions they had to process. So I'm serving on the ordained ministry committee, and we elected 4 subcommittee chairs. So we elected 7 people altogether. Local church, my understanding is, didn't elect any subcommittees because they don't have a whole lot of petitions. And so it just took time to kind of work through delegates deciding who they wanted to elect, certainly a focus on trying to have a variety of types of diversity reflected in leadership. The persons who were elected then at 4:30 went to training and dinner. And so they'll be trained in their roles. They're also going to be supported by staff. We have wonderful marshals and pages and staff, clergy and laity who have come to volunteer and to serve in roles as recorders and assistant secretaries. And so all of that work will be beginning tomorrow after morning plenary. We'll be going into legislative committees to actually begin processing the legislation. And again, depending on how many petitions a committee has, they may be breaking into subcommittee work to then report back to the general group. And it really just depends on how many petitions each legislative committee has before them. So tomorrow, again, we'll be starting with worship at 8 a.m. Baltimore Washington Conference folks, everybody, I hope that you'll tune in for opening worship. Our own Bishop Latrell Miller Easterling is going to be preaching, following the theme from the World Council of Churches on Thursdays in Black, to highlight domestic partner abuse. And so persons are invited to wear black, and I know that Bishop Easterling will offer a powerful message as part of that worship. And plenary is scheduled to begin at 8:45. So we should be in legislative committees for the first part of the morning until 10:30, quick break, and then legislative committees are scheduled to start at 10:50. If you're watching from home, you'll be able to see the live stream for plenary, but not during legislative committee work. So that's what we're going to spend the rest of the day then. Basically, once we go 10:50 into legislative committees, other than a break for lunch, then we will be in legislative committee work. So that's today. That's all of what we have. And I encourage you, if you want to follow along with the legislation, you can, if you have the Daily Christian Advocate website, if you've set up an account, you do have to pay to do that if you're not a delegate. You can set up alerts for particular legislation. And so we want to thank all of the folks working behind the scenes to process all of that data in the computer system. So I look forward to continuing to share with you. I don't expect we'll have any more updates this evening, but thank you for tuning in, and I'll check in with you tomorrow.